Alright, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to TCG Gym. Today we're going to go over the deck limited blue crocodile for the upcoming tournaments coming up. If you want to win, or the best chances of winning, I should say, you need to play blue. It is just hands down the best deck out there. It does not have a bad matchup. The hardest matchup it does have is another blue deck of similar build. And it just turns into a bounce fest at that point in time. But let's get into it. So first thing we got Law here. You got for him for sure, and then he's just a blocker. Blockers are great. Play blockers all day long. Helps you out. It slows down the game to make sure you can get set up. Same way with Boa Hancock. Bo Hancock here. While she is not as good, she costs a little bit more for 1K. That trigger is pretty substantial. So if you can manage to pull off a trigger and get extra value out of taking a life point, then it's just a huge kind of like a I guess morale boost, as well as just hurting your opponent's morale as well. It can throw off their combat math. They might be going in for the kill, then boom, all of a sudden this hits the table, and they may have overextended thinking that they could win if they didn't play cautiously enough, or they didn't probe properly, and that could actually open you up for a victory. Bartholomew Kuma. A lot of guys hate on this guy, saying he's just no good, 2-drop, 3K, blah, okay, he can fix. This guy's, again, a trigger. He could be a free fix the top of your deck, or throw those things on the bottom and help give you a better chance at getting some answers. He's also just not a bad 2-drop. All right, for a 2-drop to just go and say, hey, listen, I'm on the draw. I'm not in the play. Let's lead out with the 2-drop. Let's say you don't have a law to sit out there, or maybe you're just have a handful of counter. It's either play Law, which you can play at a later time. He takes one, and you say, I want to fix my upcoming hand real quick and see where my next 3 turns are while I have the ability to, before too much pressure from my opponent comes onto me. Sentamaru, he is by far just a beat stick. He's so much value out of this card. It's ridiculous. Getting in there, and for that 3 Dawn tying up. So here's the thing. If he's already out in play, it's a 3 Dawn. You put 1 on him, tap 2, you get that passive feast out, right? Or you have 6 open, and for 6 you get a 4K body and a 6K body. It's just a huge momentum swing right there. So he's just a beat stick. He filters out your deck, which improves the odds of drawing better cards. So much value in that card. Marshall D. Teach, probably one of the less useful cards because he takes 4, but he's really good against green, keeping Promo Kid off the board, or stalling out like some of the bouncing up their blockers to get through. Late game, he falls off pretty hard, as he's just not answering any of the things that you care about what your opponent has. So, but very good. I would say early game, like when you're on 4 Dawn, maybe 5 Dawn, and he's just really good for that, to keep pressure on your opponent early game, or at least keep the pressure off of you. Gecko Moria, some deck lists drop him. I don't know why. The guy has so much value. Just in these, like right here, Draco Mihawk, right? 2K counter, 7 Warlords of the Sea. So essentially, this guy here helps you get 8 of him. 8 2K counters. It's so much value. Okay, I'll pitch Draco Mihawk. Let's play Gecko Moria, right? I get him back. And you just keep the 2K counter in your hand. So essentially, you just tons of opportunity to play him. But, he'll also, get, say, late game, it's getting really tight on your resources and everything, and some pressure's getting on you. You play Gecko Moria, and you bring a Law back for 1. So for 5, you get a 5K and a 1K blocker. A lot of value in this card here. It's just a big, big boon to you in a late game. Early game, you could be pitching Mihawks, and you're playing him to get the Mihawk back to protect your life, not just drawing cards right off the get-go. Mihawk. I don't play Mihawk often. Generally speaking, with this build, I I don't think I've personally ever played him. Um, I've always used him for counter. It's not that he's bad. It's just the situation has never said, "Hey, listen, I feel like I have to play at 4 for a 5K body that draws twos and trash 2 cards from my hand." I've never wanted to trash 2 cards from my hand. Generally speaking, the cards here are for the most part useful. Very rarely are cards just dead cards in this, but it does happen from time to time. But most of the time, he's just counter and target for Gecko Moria. Pacifista, you have the Pacifistas in here because of Sentamaru. Run 4 of those. It's just a vanilla 4-drop 6K. Pretty solid. Crocodile. You want to run 2 crocodiles. The reason why you want to run 2 crocodiles, not 3, not 4, is because most of the time you don't want to see him. And it's not that he's bad. It's not that he's great. It's just that he takes 5. And a lot of the times, like late game, you don't have 5 resources to keep open. You're needing to do things like drop this guy here, Doflamingo, which you run 4 of. Or you're using resources to play blockers to stave off the opponent's rush. Now, yeah, he's blockers for sure, but you can go Don Quixote, Don Flamingo, and then Boa Hancock. You play him and a blocker, or Law. Or you can play Don Quixote, Don Flamingo, and have open, put one on your leader to get a 6K swing in, and have 2K open for Love Bean. Right? It just never, I won't say never, more times than not, this card, of all the cards, even though he's good, will be the dead card in your hand. He doesn't have any counter, right? It just becomes a point in time where you're tight on resources and you can't get him down without taking some serious punishment from your opponent. So having 2 of them in there, he is useful when you get them, as long as you don't get them too often and you can get them down there quick. Late game, it just becomes a dead card in your hand more times than not. So running 2 of those is probably the optimal play there. Don Quixote, Don Flamingo. Some people are not running 4 of him. Like, why you would not run 4 of this guy boggles my mind. He is such a huge tempo change. He bounces a 7 or less, right? And he's a 7K himself. Huge card right there in this format right now. And it's not only that it's just a huge card and that he's good, it's that if you don't get him, you're in serious trouble, right? It's not that the deck can't handle itself, and there's certain situations where if they don't answer your Sentamaru fast enough and you just get your Pacifistas online, then he's less important. You can just hold him in your hand. But Don Quixote, there's more, like, if for whatever reason Green decides to play, there's 7-drop. Yeah, you got Sables down here that'll help bounce it too. But, like, if you don't get this 7K body down and they just keep answering and swinging and getting your Pacifistas off, you swing a Pacifista and they just, like, turn 9K into them or 8K into it or whatever. You have to get a big body out there or you're just going to get trampled on. And the Don Quixote, Don Flamingos fill that. You need to draw them. So having 4 in there is massive. And the worst case scenario is that you get 2 of them, which means you just bounce another one of their dudes. The only thing Don Quixote, Don Flamingo does not hit is Big Boy Kaido, right? That's it. But also Big Boy Kaido does not hit Don Quixote. The only thing that hits Don Quixote is another Don Quixote. And that's what I was saying before, is that this deck's hardest matchup is another blue deck with Don Quixotes that have a similar build to it. Because then it just becomes a resource management game at that point in time. And whoever can manage the resources the best wins. Because you have to keep playing the Don Quixote. And then what will happen is, over time, your opponent might get tired of playing Don Quixote. They're going to try to overthink and strategize how to get ahead by doing something with Sables and putting it out there. but then they might make a mistake in how they manage their resources, or then they're just losing card advantage. Because what can happen is you play your Don Quixote Don Flamingo. Let's say you play your Don Quixote Don Flamingo. They play their Don Quixote Don Flamingo, and then trying to get ahead, they -4 to bounce another creature. The -4 here to bounce like a, crocodile, right? Well, what happens is, say you get another Don Quixote Don Flamingo, and if they didn't do it when they're at 9 or 10 Don, if they did it at 8, it puts them at 4. It means they're at 6, which means you're free to go a turn without another Don Flamingo hitting the board, and then you'll just pull away. So it just becomes down to resource management at that point in time. And if you're coming up another blue deck and they're running 3 Don Flamingos, you will be happy to have 4, because that means naturally you should get more, and you should be able to outplay them. Love Beam's 4. The counter ability is 4K for 2. Yeah, it sucks to leave 2 open if you don't get any value out of this card, but the way that the deck plays into it very well. As far as being at 3 or less cards, also is great, especially going up against purple, and you got Big Boy Kaido coming in for 10K, right? Well, you just pitch a 2K, you got your Dracula Mihawk, right? And you should be able to almost always have a Dracula Mihawk if you have Gecko Morias in here, right? And you should be ready for it. Pitch 1, and let's say you're at 5 cards. Pitch 1, you're at 4 cards. You play Love Beam, you're at 3 cards, and you're going to get value off this card. All right, you run 4 of these cards. They're good. They are good cards. Let's see, Sables. Sables is a good card. It's just Don Flamingo Don Quixote's ability for 4. There's been times that you hit 7, right? And you have the Don Flamingo and a Sables in hand, and then they put down a 6 or 7 drop that needs to get taken care of, and you're just trying to maneuver or get a little bit of advantage on them. Don Quixote, most of the time than not, is just the right answer. But if the situation dictates, you can also play Sables as a 4 drop and get a blocker down to protect your life. Don Quixote is great, but he's not a blocker. So getting blockers down is also just very helpful as well. But you run 4 of those, because essentially the moment that they start overextending, you're going up against blue. You have to expect, if you're green, you just can't play Kid, right? Big Boy Kid. You can't play that 7 drop because it's just going to get bounced. You have 8 cards in the deck that can target these cards, and that's just a huge tempo loss for them if they play a 7 drop, even a 6 drop. So and a lot of people, so I'll go into this a little bit. The picking order for how these limited decks are going to do in the upcoming tournaments, it goes blue, purple, green, then red. A lot of people are going green. Green's great. It's awesome. Get these big hits in there. But green can't win against this deck. It just can't. You play Centaur and you don't swing with him, right? How do they get rid of him? They have to use a straw sword to take care of him? Well, that sucks. You have 4 of these in here. They're going to use all their straw swords on him? Okay, let's say he gets them down and you protect him. Let's say you anticipate it. You wait till you have 6, then you drop him and a Pacifista. All right, well, now they got to make a decision how to use their finite number of straw swords to tap one of these things down to take care of them. Well, okay, they attacked the Centaur. Great. Okay. Well, what happens if you have another one? What happens if you have a Don Flamingo now that's putting pressure on there? It's just green can't win against this deck. And I'm not saying that they can't win in the literal sense, but if you have a competent player playing blue, this deck here, against any build of green deck, it's not going to be able to pull out a W. Now, I will say this. Blue, while this is the best deck, this deck requires the best kind of player. You need to play test every single deck because you need to know where their Don is at. You need to know, so for example, you need to play a bunch of purple. You personally need to play purple and understand the flow of purple. And I was about to get into this. People say purple's a bad matchup for this. That is not true. Now, it's not the best matchup in the world. Purple is a strong contender. But purple has a specific flow to it. So a lot of people, whenever I play, they'll scoff whenever I say, oh yeah, you bounce king. You just bounce king. Because what happens right after you play king? If their deck is running how it's supposed to be, the turn after king is played, you have big boy Kaido coming out. It's just going to happen. That's how the deck flows. You bounce king, because if you don't bounce king, what happens is Kaido comes down, another thing is blown up, and now you have a 10k and a 7k to deal with. You bounce king. Now what happens more times than not all the time, but more times than not, that king will never get played again. Never. I have played a ton of purple, and more times than not, it never gets played again. It becomes a dead, no counter card in their hand. You're like, well, why wouldn't they play it again? Well, you just negged 5 for Kaido. Okay? Okay, so, and then it would say you have your Onikishi out. You go to 6. All right, well, I can just play that next turn. No, because more times than not, your board is just Kaido. And you're going up against blue, who's got blockers out, or they have Gecko Moria out, or they have Centimaro and Pacifistas out, or they just have 2 Pacifistas out. They have Crocodile and Pacifista out. They have Don Quixote, Don Flamingo out. They have a better board than you. You have a Kaido, which they have to address. Now, I will say, if you have a handful of cards, they're more than likely just going to ignore Kaido, which would be the smart play, because they're going to swing into it. You're obviously going to defend it. But here's the other downside. Understand, like, this is why I'm saying, if you want to win, you need to play purple. You need to, like, play purple, like the deck, and understand how it works. Because there's a lot of bricks in purple. There's a lot of no counter cards in that deck, and you can almost count on their hand being half no counters, just no counter cards in their hand. And then if you do that while you're playing them, understanding where their Don's at, understanding what's going to get played next, then you can actually make assumptions and know where they're at, and if you can safely swing on Kaido. But yeah, bounce, so getting into after Kaido. After Kaido, most of the time is their board state's better than your board state. So what happens is you go to 6, next turn you go to 8. You're like, okay, cool, I got plenty to play king. Well, maybe, maybe not. Do you play king? Why? If Don Flamingo's out on the board, you don't play king. King doesn't hit Don Flamingo. It doesn't hit Crocodile. Sure, it hits a Pacifista. Sure, that's fine. It hits a blocker. But are you really worried about that? Probably not. Now, you might be worried about Crocodile, but then you just play a Brachial Bomber. Alright? So king is just like, he's a 6 for 7k. But then most of the time with their board positions, now you're worried about them just having multiple attackers hitting your life cards. So what do? You naturally go, well, I'm going to drop a queen. Draw 2 cards. That way I can get more counter in my hand to defend myself properly. That is how the deck is played. They're going to drop a queen to help stabilize their board, and they're going to draw more cards so they get more counter in their hand. They're not going to be starting dropping cards to get more done. They're not playing Jack. And they're not going to play. Maybe they play a Who's Who. You know, maybe they play a Who's Who to pick off a Centimaro if they drew into one or something like that. But most likely it's just going to be queen and have some open for Blast Breath to make sure that your Kaido stays alive after this next swing again. That's just what's going to be. Now, what does queen do? Draws more cards, right? But it minuses Dawn. Blast Breath minuses Dawn, right? And then it just keeps negging your Dawn. Okay, you get back up to 10. Well, hopefully you don't let them get back up to 10. Because generally speaking, after that Kaido's drop, you don't want another Kaido out. As a blue player, you should be putting enough pressure on them. After Kaido drops, you either, 1, kill the Kaido, and their deck is going to just fall apart and crumble after that point. Or 2, you need to have enough little critters out there swinging sideways to where they have too much pressure on them to where they can't afford to play a king. And they have to play blockers and queen and stuff like that. If you put enough pressure on them, they can't play another Kaido. It was just too much of a setback. Sure, they blow up a dude, and it might turn into 2-for-1, but if you put enough pressure on them, like that counter swing from Kaido and putting them at like 1 life card, or heck, even taking their last life card, putting them at 0, right? They can't play another Kaido even if they get back up to 10 Dawn. They have to be playing blockers and queens trying to stabilize their board and protecting their life. The moment they neg 5 and tap 9 and neg 5 to blow up a creature, maybe 2-for-1, you still got a leader that you can just go, okay, well, I'm going to drop 10 Dawn on him, swing 15k, do something about it. So, and then they go, okay, well, maybe they have a block route. Okay, it's just as simple as negging 4 and bouncing it to their hand. You know? That's just it. Or tapping 3, play a Boa Hancock, and then tap another 1 for something or whatever, or just don't tap at all and put the rest on Croc. And neg 4, bounce their blocker, and then swing in. It's just the deck has just got no real bad matchup except the mirror match. So now if you notice, there is some cards missing here, right? There's about 4 slots missing. And that is because if we go right down here, this is Edward Weevil and Jinbei. So there's 4 slots missing, right? Play test a lot. These 2 cards, 9 out of 10 times, are just counter. It's just counter. So if it's just counter, why does it matter? It's situational use. The only time I found Jinbei useful is if I am on the draw. I have 2 up, and I'm playing like blue, right? And sometimes red. I will say sometimes red. But if I'm on the draw, I get 2 Don. Not a whole lot you can do with 2 Don. You don't particularly need a blocker unless you're up against red. But then again, red can just bypass your blocker. But if you're at 2 Don, you don't have a lot to do with it. You play Jinbei. It's a 4K swing. If they come in and they get rushers and stuff, you're going to be able to get back at them. Not a lot of counter in red either. But that's the only time I really found Jinbei useful. Edward Weevil gets in those situations where you're sitting at 10 Don. You play Doflamingo. You got 3 Don open, and you're not too worried about your Love Beam, which you should always be worried about having Love Beam stuff open. But if for whatever, it's like a win more kind of deal. You have 3 open. You tap 3. You play the Edward Weevil. And that's another 5K body that you don't have to invest any more Don into to get to at least threaten some lethal damage in there. Jinbei in game, you just won't have the resources. It's just not going to come up. You always need all of your resources to invest and then some. So Jinbei, late game, you don't ever play him. He's just countered 100% of the time. So I would lean towards Jinbei. So having 4 Jinbei in there over 4 Edward Weevils, primarily because the deck in this current format doesn't have a bad matchup, except against itself, and probably purple is probably, I wouldn't say a bad matchup, but its toughest matchup. And if you can get some either extra damage in there, or if you're going up against red is just a coin flip. If they hit, you can't defend against it. If it hits and they get all the rushers through, there's just not a lot you can do about it. They either hit all their curve and then you lose, or you manage to, or they don't hit their curve and you just kill their creatures off or their characters off, and stabilize your board and you win. Jinbei's, in the instance that they are hitting everything, Jinbei is a potential way, if they're getting their great draw, to maybe throw off the numbers just enough to where you can survive to late game and then just take the rest of the game there with you. So that's why I lean towards Jinbei more so than Edward Weevil. And that, just because of those very select few instances there. So this, like I said, this is probably going to be the deck to win all the tournaments. Or at least a very, very slightly modified version of it. So this is how you win. It has the highest. I've play tested all of the decks. I have optimized all the decks. This one beats green outright. I would say it wins over. I would say probably a little over 60 to 65% of the time against purple. I mean, the mirror matchup's the mirror matchup, and against red, it's probably like 80% of the time. So beats purple, beats green, beats red, and then there's the mirror matchup. So I would say that this is the deck to have. This is how you win those big tournaments with good consistency. But again, if you are a bad player, you are going to fail. If you have not played test with all the decks, if you have not played against all the decks, and understand this deck and understand their deck, you're going to lose, right? So there is a level of skill. This is the most complicated deck to play out of the 4. So just keep that in mind whenever you're playing it. But anyways, you want to win, this is the one to play. I wish you all luck in the tournament. And I'll see y'all later.